The rain had been falling steadily for hours, drenching the small town of Pine Ridge, North Carolina, in a cold, relentless downpour. The streets, normally quiet at night, were slick and glistening under the harsh glow of streetlights. Inside the dimly lit sheriff's office, a woman sat alone at her desk, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of a coffee cup. She stared at the papers scattered in front of her thoughts elsewhere. Sheriff Miranda Devereaux was not the type of woman to let distractions affect her work, but tonight everything felt different. Miranda had always been a tough, no-nonsense sheriff. She'd been with the Pine Ridge County Sheriff's Office for over 10 years, climbing through the ranks from deputy to her current position. She had earned the respect of her colleagues, and the townsfolk looked up to her as a symbol of justice and strength. But the past few months had tested her in ways she never anticipated. Pregnant with her first child, Miranda's body had changed, and so had her life. Being pregnant while trying to maintain a demanding career had been exhausting. Her once clear focus was often clouded by the worry of what lay ahead, both for her and her unborn child. She hadn't been the same since she found out she was expecting, and the stress had only mounted as time passed. But the worst part was the betrayal. 3 months ago, Miranda had fallen in love with a man named Caleb Rhodes. He was a former convict, fresh out of prison after serving time for armed robbery. When Caleb came to town, he seemed like the perfect kind of man to help her forget the ache in her heart, the emptiness she'd been carrying for years. He was charming, confident, and undeniably handsome. To Miranda, Caleb was a new start, a chance to escape the loneliness she'd grown accustomed to. But as quickly as their relationship had begun, it had unraveled. Caleb, once so affectionate and loving, began pulling away. Miranda had tried everything to make it work, but nothing she did seemed to matter. Then 2 days ago, Caleb had come to her with a cold, final look in his eyes. He had told her it was over, that he was leaving her for her stepsister, Lisa. Miranda sat back in her chair, her hand pressed against her swollen belly. The room felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in. She had known this moment was coming. She had always feared it. But hearing the words come out of Caleb's mouth had shattered her. He had turned his back on her at the worst possible time in her life, leaving her alone, pregnant, and abandoned. The betrayal felt like a knife twisting in her gut, but she couldn't show it. Not in front of Caleb. Not in front of anyone. She had to remain strong for her baby's sake. She couldn't let anyone see how deeply this hurt. The townsfolk would never look at her the same way again if they knew how vulnerable she really was. They would think she was weak, but that was the problem. Miranda had always prided herself on her strength. Now she felt as if the one thing she had relied on for years was slipping through her fingers. And Caleb was the reason for it all. She had tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that she was better off without him, that she could raise her child on her own, without a man. But it didn't change the fact that Caleb had done this to her. And worse yet, he had chosen Lisa, her stepsister, a woman who had always envied Miranda's life, always tried to undermine her. It was like a slap in the face that Miranda couldn't ignore. Miranda wiped a tear from her cheek and stood up, pacing the room. Her mind was racing, her thoughts swirling like a storm she couldn't control. She knew she should have stayed calm. She should have let Caleb go, let him move on with his life while she focused on hers. But deep down, Miranda knew she couldn't do that. She wasn't sure if it was the hormones or the sheer rage boiling inside her, but she couldn't shake the thought of Caleb with Lisa. The hours passed, and Miranda found herself standing in front of her bedroom mirror, staring at the reflection of a woman she didn't recognize. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes red from crying. The baby inside her kicked, and she placed a hand over her stomach, taking a deep breath. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered to herself. She wasn't sure what she meant by that, but it didn't matter. Her mind was made up. She had to confront Caleb. She had to end this once and for all. And when she did, she knew exactly what she had to do. Miranda grabbed her coat and her badge from the desk. She wasn't just a sheriff anymore. She was a woman pushed to her breaking point, and she wasn't going to let anyone walk all over her. Not Caleb, not Lisa, and certainly not the world that had turned its back on her when she needed it the most. Miranda pulled up to Caleb's rundown trailer on the outskirts of town. The rain had let up, but the air was thick with tension. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the adrenaline pumping through her veins. This was it. There was no turning back now. Caleb's trailer was dark, but she knew he was inside. She had checked. He had nowhere else to go, no other place to run. She stepped out of the car and walked toward the front door. Her hand gripped the cold metal of her sheriff's badge, the weight of it grounding her in this moment of madness. She knocked on the door. There was no answer. With a deep breath, Miranda pushed open the door. It creaked loudly and she stepped inside, her boots sinking into the damp carpet. The smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke hung in the air. "Caleb?" she called out, her voice shaking but firm. A rustling sound came from the back of the trailer. Moments later, Caleb appeared, his face a mix of surprise and annoyance. "Miranda," he said, his voice flat, "what the hell are you doing here?" Her anger flared, her hands balled into fists. "I want answers, Caleb," she spat. "Why? Why her? Why Lisa?" Caleb's expression softened slightly, but he didn't seem sorry. "It's over, Miranda. I'm sorry. I thought we were done. I don't know what you want me to say." Her vision blurred with fury. "You can't just leave me like that. You can't just abandon me when I need you the most. And then you go to her? My sister?" He took a step back, his face hardening. "You need to get over it. It's done." Miranda's blood boiled, the rage rising in her chest. She wasn't sure what happened next, but one moment she was standing there, fists clenched, and the next the gun was in her hand. Her finger pulled the trigger without thinking. The sound of the gunshot echoed through the trailer. Caleb fell to the floor, his body limp, the blood pooling beneath him. Miranda stood frozen, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The reality of what she had just done was sinking in. She had killed him, and as she looked down at his lifeless body, she knew there was no going back. The next morning, a call came into the sheriff's office. A body had been found, and so began the investigation into the murder of Caleb Rhodes. The quiet town of Pine Ridge would never be the same again. The sun had barely begun to rise over Pine Ridge when the call came in. The air was cool and damp, remnants of the storm lingering in the early morning haze. The town was still half asleep, and the calmness of the moment felt almost surreal. Deputy Sarah Caldwell, a young woman with sharp instincts and an unshakable demeanor, was the first to respond to the scene. She had worked alongside Sheriff Miranda Devereaux for nearly 2 years and had always admired her mentor's strength and composure. But something was off today. There was an odd heaviness in the air, something she couldn't quite explain. As she arrived at Caleb Rhodes's trailer, Sarah could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. The trailer was cordoned off with yellow police tape, and a couple of local officers were standing guard, keeping curious onlookers away. Sarah approached the door and nodded at Officer Daniels, who had been the first to arrive on the scene. He looked shaken, his face pale. "What do we know?" Sarah asked, her voice steady but with an undertone of concern. Daniels sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "We got the call about a body in the trailer. Looks like Caleb Rhodes, the ex-con. Shot once in the chest. No signs of a struggle. The place was a mess. Beer cans, cigarette butts, the usual. But there's something strange about it. I don't know. Just doesn't feel right." Sarah knelt down, inspecting the scene. Caleb's body lay on the floor, sprawled in an awkward position, his face frozen in a grimace of shock. The blood had already begun to congeal around him, painting the floor with a grim reminder of the violence that had taken place here. One gunshot, no more, no less. The simplicity of it made Sarah uneasy. She stood up and motioned to the officers. "I want everyone to treat this like a homicide scene. No one touches anything until forensics gets here." Daniels nodded, stepping back and calling for the forensic team. It wasn't long before Sarah's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and saw a name that sent a shiver down her spine. Sheriff Miranda Devereaux. It was 6:30 a.m. Sarah had known Miranda long enough to sense when something was wrong, and the fact that Miranda was calling so early in the morning, and at a time when she'd normally be at her desk, spelled trouble. "Devereaux," Sarah answered, trying to keep her voice neutral. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Miranda spoke, her voice thick with an emotion Sarah couldn't quite place. "Sarah, I need you to come to my office. Right away." The line went dead. Sarah hung up, her stomach tightening. The brief conversation told her nothing about what was going on, but everything in her gut told her that something had happened, something serious. Without wasting another moment, Sarah got into her patrol car and drove back toward the sheriff's office. The town of Pine Ridge was still waking up, and the roads were mostly empty. As Sarah passed the small grocery store, the diner, and the county courthouse, the familiar sights of the town felt distant. Everything felt off. By the time Sarah arrived at the sheriff's office, it was just past 7 a.m. The parking lot was empty, save for her patrol car and Miranda's SUV. As she stepped out, she noticed the tension hanging in the air. There was a quiet unease, almost as if the entire town was holding its breath. Miranda was waiting inside, sitting behind her desk, her face tired and drawn. She looked different this morning, distant, lost in thought, as if she had been awake for hours. Sarah had never seen her boss like this. Miranda was always composed, always in control, but right now she seemed unraveling. "Sit down, Sarah," Miranda said, her voice low. She didn't look up as Sarah entered, her eyes locked on the papers in front of her. Sarah took a seat across from Miranda, but she didn't speak. She could feel the tension, but she knew better than to press. Miranda would speak when she was ready. Finally, Miranda exhaled, her hands gripping the edge of the desk. "Caleb Rhodes is dead," she began, her voice shaky. "Shot last night, in his trailer." She paused. "And I'm the one who did it." The words hit Sarah like a freight train. Her heart raced and her mind immediately started to piece things together. Miranda, the sheriff, had killed a man. It didn't make sense. Sarah swallowed, trying to steady her voice. "What are you saying, Miranda? Are you confessing to the murder?" Miranda nodded slowly, her face pale and grim. "I don't know what happened, Sarah. I went to his place. I confronted him. And before I knew it, the gun was in my hand. I didn't even think. I just pulled the trigger." Sarah's mind whirled. Miranda had always been tough, but this wasn't like her. This wasn't just a simple case of self-defense. Something had pushed her to the edge, something far deeper than just a confrontation. "Miranda, we need to take this slow," Sarah said softly, trying to remain calm. "We need to tell the truth. You need to let me help you, but I can't do that if we're rushing into something we don't fully understand." Miranda's eyes met Sarah's, and for the first time, there was a flicker of vulnerability. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore, Sarah," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I thought he loved me, but then he chose Lisa. I'm pregnant, Sarah. I thought Caleb was the one who would help me through this, but now I don't know what I am anymore." Her voice trailed off as tears welled up in her eyes. Sarah felt the overwhelming sadness in the room, but she also knew that this wasn't the time for pity. Miranda was her superior. She was a leader in this town, and she was also her friend. But now Sarah had to think like an investigator. "Miranda," Sarah began, her voice firm but gentle, "I want to help you, but I need you to tell me everything. What happened last night? Where were you when this all went down?" Miranda paused, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She then recounted the events from the night before. She spoke of the emotional turmoil, the confrontation with Caleb, and the impulsive decision that led her to pull the trigger. She described how Caleb had told her it was over, how he had turned his back on her for Lisa, and how the rage inside her had overwhelmed everything. She admitted that the gun had been in her hand before she had even realized what she was doing. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Miranda said, her voice breaking. "I just wanted the pain to stop. I didn't mean to kill him." Sarah listened quietly, taking note of every detail. As Miranda spoke, Sarah noticed a couple of things that seemed off. The way she described the confrontation seemed too calm. She had said the gun was in her hand before she realized it, but had it truly been a snap decision? And there was something strange about Miranda's emotions. She seemed detached from the reality of what she had done. Her words didn't match the level of shock that should have come with killing someone, even in self-defense. But Sarah knew one thing for sure. Miranda's confession was the beginning of something far bigger. Something didn't add up. "Miranda," Sarah said softly, "I'm going to help you. but we need to tell the whole truth. I need to investigate this further. We can't let this go just yet." Miranda nodded, her face resigned. She knew that she was no longer just a sheriff. She was a suspect, and everything she had worked for, the respect, the power, the control, was slipping away. But for Sarah, this was only the beginning. The investigation was just starting, and she wasn't going to stop until she uncovered the full truth. The sun climbed higher in the sky as the morning wore on, the once thick clouds slowly dissipating, leaving a pale blue canvas above Pine Ridge. But inside the sheriff's office, the storm was far from over. Sarah Caldwell sat at her desk, her thoughts swirling around the information that Miranda had just shared. She had always trusted Miranda, but something wasn't right about this confession. Sarah's mind raced as she stared at her notepad. She'd written down everything Miranda had said, trying to make sense of it all. But the more she thought about it, the more questions emerged. Why was Miranda so calm when recounting the murder? Why didn't she seem more horrified by what she had done? And why had Caleb been alone in the trailer? Sarah knew the importance of not rushing to conclusions. Miranda's version of events might not be the full truth. There were too many gaps, too many inconsistencies. Miranda had said the gun had been in her hand before she realized what was happening, but that seemed off. The sheriff wasn't the type to act on impulse, especially with everything at stake. Miranda wasn't a woman who made rash decisions, and something about the way Caleb had died, it didn't feel like a typical crime of passion. The sheriff's office was buzzing with activity, but Sarah was distracted. She knew the investigation had to begin immediately. She needed answers. A few hours later, Sarah stood at the scene of the crime once again, the place where Caleb Rhodes had taken his last breath. The forensic team had completed their initial sweep, and the crime scene was now open for further investigation. There were things that didn't add up, and Sarah was determined to find out what. She crouched by Caleb's body, her gloves slipping on the damp surface of the floor. The blood had dried, but there was no mistaking the dark crimson stains that told the story of his final moments. Sarah's eyes scanned the area. The trailer was small, and everything seemed to be in its place. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle. There was an overturned beer can near the couch, a half-eaten sandwich left on a plate, and the television remote sitting on the coffee table. But there were no obvious signs of chaos, no evidence of a violent confrontation. It didn't match Miranda's description of what had happened. Sarah stood and began examining the other parts of the room more closely. Near the bedroom door, she noticed something strange, a pair of boots. Men's boots, but not Caleb's. They were dark brown, polished and neatly placed by the wall, as if someone had intentionally put them there. Sarah's pulse quickened. Who else had been in the trailer last night? She carefully moved closer to the boots, noting their size and style. They didn't belong to Caleb. That much was clear. Her eyes shifted to the nightstand near the bed. There was a picture frame with a photo of Caleb and a woman, her stepsister Lisa. The realization hit Sarah hard. Lisa had been with Caleb recently, and it didn't seem like the relationship was over. In fact, it seemed to have just begun. Could Lisa have been here that night? Sarah's gut told her that something wasn't right about Caleb's relationship with Miranda and Lisa. She needed to find Lisa, but first there was something else she had to do. Go through the phone records. Back at the sheriff's office, Sarah pored over the details of Caleb's cell phone records. The call logs were straightforward, mostly calls to and from family members, some acquaintances. But one number stood out to her, a local number from a private line. It had called Caleb multiple times in the hours leading up to his death. Sarah's instincts told her this was important. She pulled the contact information for the number and traced it back to a house on the edge of town, just a few miles from where Caleb had lived. At the house, Sarah knocked on the door, the early evening light casting long shadows across the yard. The house was modest, an old wooden structure with peeling paint and an overgrown lawn. It was quiet, eerily so. The door creaked open, and standing in the frame was a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and tired eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice thick with southern drawl. "I'm Deputy Sarah Caldwell with the Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department," Sarah said, flashing her badge. "I'm investigating the murder of Caleb Rhodes. I need to ask you a few questions." The man stiffened at the mention of Caleb's name, But then, to Sarah's surprise, he stepped aside and let her in. "Please, come on in. I was expecting you," the man said, his tone uncomfortably casual. Sarah entered the house, glancing around. It was dark. Inside, the curtains drawn tightly, the faint smell of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. The man gestured for her to sit, but Sarah remained standing. "Who are you?" she asked, suspicion growing in her chest. The man nodded slowly, his hands twitching nervously. "I'm Earl Rhodes, Caleb's uncle." Sarah hadn't expected this. Earl Rhodes was an enigma. Caleb's family wasn't known for making appearances in town, and it seemed odd that Earl would live so far from the rest of them. Earl's dark eyes met hers, and Sarah could see a flicker of something, guilt maybe. She wasn't sure. "I'm sorry for your loss, Earl," Sarah said, her voice measured, "but I need to ask you about Caleb's phone records. He made a series of calls to this number late last night. Can you tell me who he was talking to?" Earl shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his gaze flicking to the window, then back to Sarah. "I reckon you'll find out soon enough. Caleb's been messing with things he shouldn't have, Deputy. He got involved with some unsavory folks. Folks that ain't too happy with him." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean by that?" Earl hesitated before continuing. "I didn't want Caleb to get mixed up in all that, but he was. It's not just Lisa. There were others. People he owed money to. People who don't forget." Sarah's heart raced. This was something new. If Caleb had debts, if he was entangled with dangerous people, it would explain a lot. It could even explain why someone might have come after him. Maybe Miranda didn't know the full extent of Caleb's situation. "Do you know who he owed?" Sarah pressed, her voice firm but calm. "Is it possible that someone else was involved in his death?" Earl shifted again, his expression faltering. "I don't know the names, but I know Caleb had been in touch with a few people from his past, people who don't take kindly to betrayal. And as for the money, well, he was doing some things that weren't exactly legal." Sarah's mind whirled with the implications of this new information. Caleb had been more than just a heartbreaker. He had debts. And worse yet, he had crossed paths with people who wouldn't hesitate to harm him for the right price. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there was still too much she didn't understand. Had Caleb's debts led to his murder? Or was there something more personal at play? And what about Miranda's role in all of this? One thing was clear: the investigation was far from over, and the truth was buried beneath layers of secrets and lies. The next few days passed slowly for Sarah, like the calm before a storm. She spent her time reviewing Caleb's financial records, trying to trace his debts and figure out who might have wanted him dead. She spoke with people who had known Caleb, but they offered little more than vague recollections of a man who had been living on the edge. He'd done time for small-time crimes, petty theft, drug possession, but nothing that seemed to explain his violent end. But as Sarah dug deeper, one thing kept gnawing at her: the connections Caleb had. He was tied to people who operated in the shadows, people who didn't hesitate to use violence to settle scores. There were whispers in town of Caleb's association with a group called the Crew, a collection of local criminals who often worked in the fringes of the drug trade. But no one seemed to have concrete evidence linking him to them. But then a break came. Sarah was reviewing the security footage from the gas station near Caleb's trailer when she noticed something odd. The footage from the night of Caleb's death was grainy, but it showed a man pulling up in a black truck around 9:30 p.m. The truck wasn't one Sarah recognized, but the man inside looked familiar. He was a regular in Pine Ridge, known for his shady dealings and reputation for intimidation. His name was Thomas "Tommy" Walker, a member of the Crew. Sarah's breath caught in her chest. She'd heard rumors about Tommy for years. He wasn't someone anyone wanted to mess with. A few people had tried to stand up to him, and all of them had either ended up in prison or worse. He was known for being ruthless. The fact that he had been near Caleb's trailer the night of his murder was no coincidence. Sarah called her team together, and they spent the next few hours gathering information on Tommy Walker. His record was long: assault, theft, weapons charges, and even a few unsolved homicides. It was clear that he was no stranger to violence. The question was he the one who had killed Caleb, or was he just another piece of the puzzle? The next morning, Sarah visited Lisa Rhodes, Caleb's ex-girlfriend, at her modest home on the outskirts of town. Sarah had tried to get in touch with Lisa several times, but the young woman had been avoiding her calls. Lisa had been one of the last people to see Caleb alive, and Sarah needed answers. When Lisa answered the door, she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red-rimmed and her clothes were disheveled, as though she hadn't bothered to change in a while. The weight of grief was heavy on her, but there was something more, an air of anxiety that Sarah couldn't quite place. "Deputy Caldwell," Lisa said, her voice quiet but defensive. "What do you want?" "I just need to ask you a few questions, Lisa," Sarah said gently. "About Caleb. You were with him last night, right? Can you tell me what happened?" Lisa hesitated for a long moment, her eyes flicking toward the door as if she were considering slamming it in Sarah's face. But then, after a deep breath, she stepped aside and let Sarah in. The inside of the house was cramped, with worn furniture and a faint smell of stale cigarettes. Lisa motioned for Sarah to sit at the small kitchen table, her hands nervously twisting a dish towel as she finally spoke. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Lisa whispered. "I never wanted Caleb to get hurt. We were trying to make things work, you know? He was just so lost after everything. After he went to prison, it was like he was a different person. But I didn't want to be the one who put him in that world, that life. He was always trying to get out, but he kept falling back in." Sarah listened closely, her mind processing the words. Lisa seemed sincere, but there was something in her voice, a quiver, that made Sarah suspicious. It sounded like she was trying to convince herself more than she was trying to convince Sarah. "I know Caleb wasn't perfect," Lisa continued, "but I loved him, and he loved me too, even after everything that happened between him and Miranda. But then, when I found out he was still in touch with her, I just—" She stopped herself, biting her lip. "Still in touch with Miranda?" Sarah repeated. "What do you mean?" Lisa glanced away, her eyes avoiding Sarah's. "Caleb was seeing her again, even after he told me it was over between us. He didn't tell me everything, but I could tell. I didn't want to believe it at first, but I found his phone one day, and there were texts between them. It wasn't just casual. They were planning to meet up. He wasn't just over her. He was still attached to her." A cold chill ran down Sarah's spine. Could Caleb have been seeing Miranda again, even as he was trying to fix things with Lisa? And if so, how did Lisa feel about that? Was it jealousy that had sparked the chain of events leading to his death? "Do you think Miranda knew about you and Caleb?" Sarah asked, watching Lisa closely. Lisa's eyes flashed with something, anger, betrayal. It was hard to say. "She must have," Lisa spat, her tone suddenly sharp. "She was always keeping him on a leash. I don't know what kind of hold she had over him, but I know it was there. And when I found out about it, I tried to confront him, but he was already pulling away. He was so damn stubborn." Sarah tried to make sense of Lisa's words. There was a lot of anger in her voice, but also a lot of pain. Lisa was hurt. She had been betrayed by both Caleb and Miranda. But what had really happened that night? Had jealousy played a part in Caleb's death? "Did Caleb mention anything about a man named Tommy Walker?" Sarah asked, looking for any clue that might tie Lisa to the dangerous criminal. At the mention of Tommy's name, Lisa's face went pale. She froze, her hands suddenly still. "Tommy Walker? I don't know him. Caleb never talked about him. Why?" Sarah's heart rate quickened. It was a reaction that spoke volumes. "Lisa, I need you to be honest with me. Caleb had connections to people who weren't exactly law-abiding. Tommy Walker is one of those people. If Caleb was involved with him—" Lisa cut her off, standing abruptly and backing away. "I don't know anything about that," she shouted, her voice panicked. "I swear to God I don't know. I just wanted to have a normal life with him. I didn't know anything about his past. He never told me about those people. He was always so secretive." Sarah stood up slowly, watching Lisa's reaction carefully. The sudden outburst felt like a red flag, but she didn't press any further. There were too many contradictions, too many half-truths, and at the moment, it wasn't clear where the lies began. "All right, Lisa," Sarah said, keeping her voice calm. "But I'll need to speak with you again. There's a lot more going on than you realize. If you want to help yourself, tell me everything you know." no matter how small it seems? Lisa just nodded, her eyes filled with uncertainty. Sarah left the house, her mind racing. Lisa had been keeping secrets. She was involved in Caleb's life in ways that went deeper than she had admitted. But did she have anything to do with his death? Or was she just a pawn in a much larger game? As Sarah walked back to her car, one thing was becoming clear. The tangled web of lies, secrets, and betrayal wasn't going to be easy to untangle, but she was determined to find the truth, no matter how many layers she had to peel back. Sarah's head was heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. Her visit with Lisa had raised more doubts than it had resolved, and now, with the pieces of Caleb's life, his secrets, his debts, his relationships, sprawling across her mind like a jigsaw puzzle, Sarah couldn't ignore the gnawing sense that something was slipping through the cracks. She had been sheriff of Pine Ridge for years, and in all that time, she had learned that every case had its twists and turns, its moments of false hope and dead ends. But this case, it felt different. The lives of the people involved were tied together by threads far more fragile than they realized, and one wrong tug might unravel them all. The sun was setting by the time Sarah got back to her office, and the soft glow of the orange light pouring through the blinds did little to ease the ache in her bones. She rubbed her temples, exhausted from the hours of phone calls, interviews, and the constant running in circles. Before she could sit down, Sarah's phone buzzed. Another call from Miranda. For a moment she hesitated. Miranda was becoming more and more difficult to trust, but there was something about her tone earlier in their conversations that Sarah couldn't shake. She needed to hear what Miranda had to say. "Sheriff Caldwell," she answered the phone, her voice cool but expectant. "Sarah," Miranda's voice cracked, trembling with what sounded like fear. I need to talk to you, in person." Sarah's stomach tightened. Miranda was never this frantic. Something had changed. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, Sarah replied, already grabbing her keys. She knew she couldn't ignore this. If Miranda had something important to share, it could be the missing link. Miranda was sitting at the local diner when Sarah arrived. The place was nearly empty, the usual hum of conversation absent as the evening crowd had yet to arrive. Sarah could see Miranda through the window, her head down, her hands fidgeting with a napkin as she stared at the empty coffee cup in front of her. Sarah walked in, taking a seat across from her. The silence between them was heavy, as though both women were unsure of where to start. "You wanted to talk?" Sarah asked, trying to maintain her professional demeanor. Miranda glanced up, her eyes red and puffy, though there were no fresh tears. "I don't know how to say this, Sarah, but I need you to know the truth." She hesitated, biting her lip. "I didn't kill Caleb because of jealousy." "Not exactly." Sarah raised an eyebrow, the words catching her off guard. "Then why?" Miranda swallowed hard. "Caleb wasn't the man I thought he was. He wasn't good to me. He promised me so many things, but he kept leaving me for other women. I kept thinking he was going to come back for me, that things would get better, but it never did. He was always using me, Sarah. Always. And when I found out about Lisa, when I realized he was still with her, still lying to me, I just lost it. I wanted to confront him. I thought I could make him see how much he hurt me." Miranda's eyes flitted down to the table, her hands curling into fists. "I didn't plan to kill him, I swear. But when I went to his trailer, when I saw him there with her picture, his ex-girlfriend, something just snapped. I didn't know what I was doing. It was like my mind went blank. And before I knew it, the gun was in my hand." Sarah was silent for a long moment, taking in the confession. Miranda wasn't giving the full picture, not yet, but it was a significant piece of the puzzle. The motive was becoming clearer, heartbreak and betrayal. But Sarah also knew there was more to the story. She could feel it. "You're telling me you shot him in a moment of rage," Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. "But there's one thing that doesn't add up. If you went there to confront him, why were you the only one who was there when he died? Why didn't you call for help? Why didn't you get out of the trailer?" Miranda's face paled. I didn't. I was scared, okay? I just wanted to get out of there. I didn't want to go to jail. I panicked, and I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I should have called for help, I know, but I didn't think about it. Sarah felt the tension in the room rise. Miranda's story was beginning to crumble at the edges, and the gaps were widening. Something wasn't right. She knew Miranda too well to think this was the whole truth. There's more, Miranda, Sarah pressed, her voice more urgent now. Who else was involved? Was anyone else there with you? Miranda's eyes darted to the side, and Sarah noticed her hands trembling as she fidgeted with the edge of her napkin. I don't know what you mean. You didn't act alone, did you? Sarah said, her tone sharp. You didn't just show up and shoot him. There's someone else, isn't there? Miranda's eyes dropped to her lap, her breath shallow. It was the hesitation that Sarah was looking for, the admission that Miranda wasn't as innocent as she claimed to be. After what felt like an eternity, Miranda's voice broke. Tommy Walker. He was there too. He made me do it. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. Tommy Walker. It made sense. The pieces were falling into place now, and she could see the full picture beginning to form in her mind. Tommy was there? Sarah repeated, her voice low. What do you mean he made you do it? Miranda's face was pale, her eyes hollow with guilt. He showed up at Caleb's trailer right before I did. He said he was there to collect what Caleb owed him. I didn't know what to do. He told me that if I didn't take care of Caleb, that he'd make sure my life was ruined. He said Caleb had crossed him, and if I didn't kill him, Tommy would make sure I would never see another day of peace. Miranda's breath hitched as she spoke, her face crumpling in remorse. I didn't want to do it, Sarah, but I was scared. Tommy has a way of getting inside your head. I didn't think I had any other choice. I was desperate. Sarah clenched her jaw, her mind racing. Miranda had been coerced. It wasn't just about rage or heartbreak. She had been pushed into a corner by a man who was dangerous, someone with ties to people who weren't afraid to kill. But that still didn't explain everything. Where is Tommy now? Sarah asked, her voice tight. Miranda looked down, almost ashamed. I haven't seen him since that night. He told me to stay quiet and that everything would go away. But I'm scared. He's dangerous, Sarah. He's not the kind of person you want to cross. He'll come after me if he knows I've said anything. The silence between them was thick as Sarah processed what Miranda had said. Tommy Walker had pulled the strings, using Miranda as his puppet to silence Caleb. And it had worked. But Sarah wasn't about to let Tommy Walker walk free. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. I need you to come with me, Sarah said, standing up. We're going to find Tommy, and we're going to put him behind bars where he belongs. You're not alone in this, Miranda. But you need to trust me. Miranda looked up at Sarah, her eyes wide with fear. But for the first time, there was a flicker of something else. Relief. She nodded slowly, as if she was beginning to believe that justice might still be within reach. As Sarah led Miranda out of the diner, her thoughts were already on the next steps. Tommy Walker was a dangerous man, and she had no intention of letting him slip through her fingers. The truth was out there, buried beneath the lies and fear. But Sarah was determined to find it, no matter what it took. Sarah couldn't shake the urgency in Miranda's voice. Tommy Walker was not just a criminal. He was a force of destruction. He was the kind of man who operated in the shadows, using manipulation and fear to control the lives of everyone around him. Caleb, Lisa, Miranda, none of them had stood a chance against him. But Sarah wasn't about to let him slip away, not this time. The drive back to the sheriff's office was a blur. Sarah's mind was racing, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she tried to focus. She could feel the pressure mounting, knowing that every second wasted could be another step closer to Tommy slipping through her grasp. Miranda sat in the passenger seat, her hands trembling, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. Sarah could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else too. Resignation. Miranda had been living in a state of constant dread, always looking over her shoulder, always afraid of what Tommy might do next. Do you have any idea where he might be? Sarah asked, her voice soft but steady. Miranda shook her head slowly. Number. He's good at disappearing. He's always kept to himself. I don't even know where he lives or who he really talks to. I just know that when he shows up, he gets what he wants. No questions asked. Sarah's jaw clenched. Tommy was dangerous, but he wasn't invincible. He couldn't hide forever. If there was one thing Sarah had learned over the years, It was that people like Tommy always made mistakes. They were too arrogant, too confident that they could get away with anything. As soon as Sarah pulled into the sheriff's office parking lot, she got out of the car, her mind focused. She knew she had to act fast. Tommy wouldn't wait around for her to catch up. He would be gone if she didn't. Move quickly. Inside, she was met by her deputy, James, who was hunched over a stack of paperwork. He looked up as Sarah entered, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Sheriff, you got a minute?" he asked. "Not really," Sarah replied curtly, "but I'll make time. What do you have for me?" James pushed a folder across the desk, his face serious. "I did some digging into Tommy Walker's background. It's extensive." Sarah sat down, flipping through the file. It was a long list: robberies, assaults, weapons charges, connections to drug rings, and even a few unsolved murders. But there was one thing that stood out. Tommy had been known to frequent a few locations around Pine Ridge, including an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. "He likes to lay low there," James said, his voice low. "It's a good place for him to hide. No one bothers him there, not even the local cops. The place has been on the radar for a while, but we never had enough evidence to make a move." Sarah's pulse quickened. She knew the warehouse James was talking about. It was a decrepit building, located near the old mill, isolated from the rest of town. It was the perfect place for someone like Tommy to hide. But that also made it the perfect place for Sarah to finally corner him. She closed the file with a snap. "Get the team together. We're going after him." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the desolate landscape, Sarah and her team made their way to the warehouse. The air was thick with tension, the kind of quiet before a storm. Miranda was with them, sitting in the back of the cruiser, her hands still trembling, but her expression more determined now than it had been when they first spoke. "I'm not going to arrest you, Miranda," Sarah said as they neared the warehouse. "I know you didn't want this, but I need you to stay back. I need to take Tommy down." Miranda nodded, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Doubt. Sarah couldn't blame her. Miranda had been manipulated by Tommy, used like a pawn in his game. But that didn't mean she could just walk away from this. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and ominous, its broken windows staring back at them like hollow eyes. The smell of rust and decay hung in the air. The place felt abandoned, yet there was an unsettling silence, like the calm before the storm. "Stay sharp," Sarah ordered, her voice low but firm. "We don't know what we're walking into." The team moved quickly, positioning themselves around the perimeter of the warehouse. Sarah and James approached the main entrance, weapons drawn, while the rest of the team took cover nearby. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest, her thoughts racing. This was it. This was her chance to take Tommy down once and for all. They breached the door quietly, their steps echoing in the empty building. The interior was dark and cavernous, filled with abandoned machinery and crates. The air was thick with dust, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed in the distance. But there was no sign of Tommy. Sarah's instincts told her to keep moving, to keep searching. She motioned for James to follow as they advanced further into the warehouse, their footsteps muffled by the worn concrete floor. The place was a maze of old equipment and rusted pipes, but Sarah kept her focus. She wasn't going to let Tommy slip away again. As they rounded a corner, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. There, in the dim light of a nearby storage room, was Tommy. He was standing by a stack of crates, his back to them, unaware of their presence. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was him. The man who had haunted Pine Ridge for years. The man who had terrorized so many. But now he was cornered. Now he had nowhere to run. "Tommy!" Sarah called out, her voice sharp. Tommy spun around, his eyes narrowing as he reached for the gun tucked into his waistband. But Sarah was quicker. She fired a warning shot into the air, and Tommy froze, his hands raised in the air. "You're done, Tommy," Sarah said, her voice cold with determination. "You're not getting away this time." For a moment, Tommy just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then with a sneer, he dropped his hands to his sides. "You think you've got me, Sheriff? You think you can put me behind bars and stop me?" "We've got everything we need to put you away," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "And you're not getting out of here alive unless you make it easy for us." Tommy's eyes flickered with something. Anger, frustration, but also a hint of fear. He knew he was trapped. He knew there was nowhere left to run. "Maybe you're right," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "But don't think this is over, Sheriff. It's never over. Not with people like me." Sarah's heart pounded as she approached him, her eyes never leaving his. She had the upper hand now, but she knew better than to let her guard down. Tommy was dangerous, and he wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to survive. "You're finished," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "You'll never hurt anyone again." The team moved in, quickly securing Tommy's arms behind his back and taking him into custody. As they led him away, Sarah felt a rush of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the damage Tommy had done would never truly go away. The scars he had left on Pine Ridge, on people like Miranda, Lisa, Caleb, would linger for years. But at least now, for the first time in a long time, the people of Pine Ridge could breathe a little easier. Tommy Walker was behind bars, and Sarah had made sure of it. As the last of the team secured the warehouse and began their search for evidence, Sarah stood in the doorway, staring out into the darkness of the night. There was still work to do, more secrets to uncover, more people to help. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Tommy Walker was finally going to face justice, and Sarah Caldwell had done what she promised. She had protected her town, no matter the cost. The weeks following Tommy Walker's arrest were filled with an eerie quiet that hung over Pine Ridge like a fog. There was a sense of relief in the air, but it wasn't the kind that allowed anyone to sleep easy. The town had been living under the shadow of fear for so long, and now with Tommy behind bars, the community was trying to find its footing again. Sarah spent her days poring over case files, conducting interviews, and making sure the remnants of Tommy's criminal empire were dismantled piece by piece. But her mind was never far from what had brought her here: the murder of Caleb Hayes, the lies, the manipulation, and the ripple effects that had changed everything. As the trial approached, Sarah knew the journey ahead wasn't going to be easy. Miranda's role in Caleb's death was undeniable, but Sarah also understood that the situation wasn't as black and white as it seemed. Miranda had been coerced, pushed into a corner by a man who used fear to get what he wanted. Still, she would have to face the consequences of her actions, and Sarah's job was to ensure that justice was served. One late afternoon, Sarah sat alone in her office, reviewing the final reports on Tommy Walker's arrest. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway, and the door creaked open. It was Miranda. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly, her voice hesitant. Sarah looked up from the papers on her desk, her expression softening. She had seen Miranda a lot in the past few weeks, each time more fragile and broken than before. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Of course. Sit down," Sarah said, trying to keep her tone neutral. Miranda hesitated for a moment, then took a seat. Her hands rested nervously in her lap as she avoided making eye contact with Sarah. "I wanted to thank you," Miranda said after a long pause, "for everything you've done, for not giving up on me. I know I made a terrible mistake, and I know I can never undo it, but I needed to say it." Sarah's gaze softened. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping on the edge of the desk. "You didn't have a choice, Miranda. Tommy put you in a terrible position, but that doesn't change what happened." Miranda nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know, and I'm sorry for everything. For Caleb, for Lisa, for you." Sarah's chest tightened. Miranda was clearly struggling, but Sarah couldn't help but feel conflicted. Miranda had been a victim of circumstances, but at the end of the day, a life had been lost, a life that would never come back. "I'm not the one you need to apologize to," Sarah said quietly, "but I know you're trying to make things right, and that counts for something." Miranda's lips trembled. "I don't know what happens next, Sheriff. I don't know what the trial's going to be like, or how I'll face the people I hurt. But I just want to make amends. I don't want to be the person I was before all of this." Sarah paused, considering her words carefully. "You can start by telling the truth, Miranda. You already have. The rest will be up to the courts." Miranda nodded again, her voice breaking. "I was so lost, Sarah. I thought Caleb was my chance at a life that mattered. But when I found out about Lisa, when I realized I'd been nothing but a fool, Everything fell apart. Tommy used me to make everything worse, and I was too weak to see it. Sarah sat in silence for a long moment, weighing her thoughts. She had heard Miranda's side of the story, but she also knew that the weight of Caleb's death wouldn't be lifted just by her confession. The road to redemption wasn't an easy one. There would be consequences even for those who had been manipulated. "You're not the first person to make a mistake," Sarah finally said, "but you have to own it. The truth will make a difference in the end. It always does." The trial began a few weeks later. The courtroom was packed with the usual suspects: townspeople, reporters from nearby cities, and a few curious onlookers. Sarah stood in the back, watching as Miranda took the stand. Her hands were shaking as she recounted the events of that fateful night. The confrontation with Caleb, the arrival of Tommy, and the gunshot that had shattered everything. Sarah had prepared Miranda for the tough questions. She knew that defense attorneys would be relentless, attempting to paint her as a cold-blooded killer, no matter what had led to her actions. But Sarah also knew that the truth, every painful piece of it, would come out, and it would be the jury's job to decide what kind of punishment Miranda deserved. The prosecution didn't waste time in painting a picture of a young woman who had been manipulated by a dangerous criminal. They painted Tommy Walker as the mastermind, the one who had orchestrated the events that led to Caleb's death, using Miranda as a pawn in his twisted game. They didn't deny Miranda's guilt, but argued that she had acted under duress, under fear for her life. When it was time for the defense to speak, things took a different turn. The defense attorney tried to create doubt about Miranda's version of events, suggesting that she had acted out of jealousy and rage, and that Tommy was simply a convenient scapegoat. The argument didn't hold much weight, but it still planted seeds of doubt in the minds of some of the jurors. Sarah watched Miranda as she sat at the witness stand, her face pale and tired, her eyes full of regret. It was clear that Miranda was struggling, not just with the trial, but with the reality of what she had done. There was no getting around it. Caleb was dead, and nothing would change that. But there was something else Sarah noticed as she watched Miranda, the subtle shift in her demeanor. Miranda wasn't just a woman on trial for a crime. She was a woman who had learned the hard way what betrayal, manipulation, and guilt felt like. And somehow Sarah knew that Miranda was beginning to understand the gravity of her actions. She had been broken by it, but perhaps there was hope for her yet. A week later, the jury deliberated. The courthouse was tense as everyone waited for a decision. The final moments dragged on as the clock ticked past 5 in the afternoon. Finally, the jury returned with their verdict. "Guilty, but with mitigating circumstances," the foreman announced. "We recommend a sentence of 10 years, with the possibility of parole after 5. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her chest. It wasn't the outcome she had hoped for. She wanted more. She wanted Tommy Walker to pay for everything, to be held accountable for all the damage he had caused, but she also knew that the jury had considered everything. Miranda's lack of intent to kill, her manipulation by Tommy, and her willingness to cooperate with the investigation. It was a verdict that balanced justice with mercy. And while it wouldn't bring Caleb back, it was something. As Sarah walked out of the courthouse, the evening air was cool against her skin. She stopped for a moment, taking in the quiet of Pine Ridge. For the first time in a long while, the town felt different. The weight of Tommy's presence was gone. And though there were still broken pieces to pick up, the darkness seemed a little less suffocating. Miranda had a long road ahead of her, but she would have time. Time to reflect, to change, and to hopefully find redemption. For Sarah, the case was closed, but the lessons lingered. Sometimes justice was about more than just punishment. It was about healing, understanding, and making sure that those who had been broken by others didn't break themselves further. Sarah looked out over the town, her thoughts lingering on the people who still needed her. The job was never done, and there would always be more cases to solve, more lives to protect. But for now at least, Pine Ridge was a little safer, and Sarah Caldwell had done her job.